Long before the first stones of London were laid, the valley of the River Thames already carried the footsteps of human history. Archaeologists tell us that by the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago, groups of hunter-gatherers began to follow the Thames' meandering waters, fishing its banks, hunting its forests, and leaving traces of their existence in the soil. The river itself, broad, tidal, and unpredictable, was more than a source of life. It was a barrier, a frontier, and a highway. It shaped how people moved, settled, and dreamed. And so, when we speak of London's story, we begin not with bricks or walls, but with the quiet marks left by communities who lived and died long before the city had a name. In 2010, archaeologists uncovered a scatter of flint tools on the south bank of the Thames near Vauxhall. These belonged to Mesolithic hunters, perhaps from 6000 BCE, their lives tied to the rhythm of river and forest. At nearby Battersea, later finds included bronze and iron weapons deliberately thrown into the Thames as offerings. Among them, the Battersea Shield, a Celtic masterpiece of red enamel and bronze, dating to around the 3rd century BCE. Its presence suggests not only religious ritual, but also the deep symbolic importance of the Thames as a sacred boundary. By the Bronze Age, c. 1500 to 600 BCE, small farming communities dotted the Thames Valley. Wooden trackways discovered in peat at Vauxhall and Bermondsey show how locals built paths across marshland, connecting islands of settlement. These were the precursors of London's bridges, fragile but essential links across the shifting landscape. In this age, burial mounds rose on surrounding hills, some surviving today as earthworks in Richmond Park. By the Iron Age, c. 600 BCE onwards, powerful tribes dominated the area. Chief among them were the Trinovans to the east and the Catavilani to the west. Their hill forts, such as those at Uphall Camp in Ilford or Caesar's Camp near Heathrow, guarded their territories. They traded, fought, and offered sacrifices to their gods along the Thames. Their world was one of ritual and rivalry, with the river at its heart. When Julius Caesar landed in Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, his writings gave us the first glimpse of this land. Though Caesar never founded a city here, he described the Thames as a formidable river with stakes and defenses driven into its shallows to block invaders. He encountered tribes who painted their bodies, rode chariots, and worshipped in sacred groves. Among them were the ancestors of those who would one day inhabit the future site of London. For nearly a century after Caesar's brief expeditions, Rome did not return. But the tribes of Britain changed. They grew wealthier, trading with continental Europe. Coins minted by local rulers, such as Adadamarus of the Trinovans, c. 20 to 10 BC, circulated widely. His successor, Dubnovalanus, maintained ties with Rome. Yet by the early 1st century CE, another tribal leader, Cunobelinus of the Catavilani, rose to power. Ruling from Cumulodunum, modern Colchester, he expanded his authority into the Thames Valley. Roman historians even called him King of the Britons. This shifting tribal landscape set the stage for Rome's full-scale invasion. In 43 CE, the Emperor Claudius ordered his legions to conquer Britain. Under the general Aulus Plautius, Roman forces landed on the Kentish coast and advanced inland. Within weeks, they crossed the Thames. Tacitus tells us of fierce resistance, of tribes retreating into marshes and forests, of warriors plunging into the river to fight among its waters. But Rome's discipline prevailed. In these campaigns, the seeds of London were sown. The Romans needed a site, a place to bridge the Thames, to build a port, to anchor their conquest. They found it at a narrow point where the river could be crossed, close to the confluence of other routes leading into Britain's interior. Here, on the north bank, lay a patch of relatively dry ground, with a gentle slope down to the water's edge. It was unremarkable, yet perfectly placed. By 47 CE, Just 4 years after the conquest, a settlement had begun to rise. Its name was Londinium, and this is where the history of London started. The origins of this name remain mysterious. Some scholars link it to an ancient pre-Roman word, perhaps of Celtic origin, meaning wild or bold. Others suggest it came from a personal name or from the river itself. But whatever its root, Londinium marked a beginning. At first, it was little more than a cluster of wooden structures and a makeshift wharf, built by merchants who saw opportunity in Rome's new frontier. But its location was fateful. From Londinium, goods could be shipped down the Thames to the Channel and across to Gaul, or carried inland along newly constructed Roman roads. Watling Street to the northwest, Ermine Street to the north, Stane Street to the south. Within a generation, Londinium would eclipse older tribal centers like Camulodunum to become the most important city in Roman Britain. But before that rise, before the Forum, the Basilica, and the Great Stone Walls, London was still only an idea, a fragile outpost at the edge of empire. Around it lingered the memory of older worlds, Mesolithic hunters, Bronze Age farmers, Iron Age chieftains, all of whom had left their mark on this place beside the river. The story of London is not simply Roman. It is a palimpsest, each layer written over the last. And it is here, in 47 CE, amid the smoke of Roman forges and the echo of marching legions, that its recorded history truly begins. When Londinium was founded around 47 CE, it was not a grand design of emperors, but the work of traders, merchants, and soldiers who recognized its potential. The site lay at a strategic bend in the Thames, a place where the river could be bridged and where roads from every corner of Roman Britain would one day converge. By 50 CE, Londinium had become more than an encampment. Timber warehouses and wharves lined the river, while artisans, shopkeepers, and Roman officials filled its streets. Within just a few years, it had grown into a bustling port, the largest in the new province of Britannia. But London's early prosperity was fragile. In 60 or 61 CE, disaster struck. The Iceni Queen Boudica, enraged by Roman exploitation after the death of her husband Prasutagus, raised a rebellion that swept through Roman Britain. Tacitus and Cassius Dio recount how her forces destroyed Camulodunum, the colony at Colchester, before turning on Londinium. Governor Suetonius Paulinus faced a choice: defend the city or save the province. He chose the latter, abandoning Londinium to its fate. Boudica's warriors poured in, torching the settlement. Archaeologists have uncovered a thick layer of ash beneath modern London, the Boudican destruction horizon, filled with charred timbers, shattered pottery, and coins melted by fire. Thousands of inhabitants were slaughtered. Londinium, barely a decade old, was reduced to ruins. Yet Rome rebuilt. By the 70s CE, Londinium rose again, this time planned as a proper Roman city. Streets were laid out in a grid, a forum and basilica constructed at its center. Stone temples honored Roman gods, while bathhouses, amphitheaters, and warehouses spread outward. By the end of the century, Londinium had become the capital of Roman Britain, eclipsing older tribal centers. At its height, the city may have held 30,000 to 45,000 people, a remarkable size for the province, and one of the largest cities north of the Alps. Its population was diverse: Romans from Italy, Gauls from modern France, traders from the Rhineland, sailors from Spain, freedmen from North Africa, even Syrians and Greeks. They brought with them foreign gods, whose altars have been found along the Walbrook stream. Mithras, Isis, and Jupiter Dolichinas all worshipped in the shadow of the Thames. The London Bridge, built of timber, carried traffic across the Thames, linking Londinium with routes into Kent and the continent. Along the riverfront, granaries stored grain for the legions, while amphorae carried olive oil, wine, and fish sauce from distant provinces. But Londinium was not immune to catastrophe. In 122 CE, as Emperor Hadrian visited Britain to oversee the construction of his Great Wall in the north, Londinium remained vital to imperial administration. Yet in 125 CE, a fire tore through the city, leaving blackened remains still visible beneath modern buildings. It was rebuilt once again, this time with greater ambition. By the 2nd century, Londinium was a thriving Roman metropolis. The Great Basilica, completed around 140 CE, was the largest building of its kind north of the Alps, stretching over 2 hectares. The amphitheater, built around 70 CE and later expanded, hosted gladiatorial contests and spectacles for the urban population. Public baths offered leisure and hygiene, while markets bustled with goods from across the empire. But London's prosperity waxed and waned with the fortunes of Rome. Around 160 CE, a major fire devastated parts of the city once again. Rebuilding continued, but signs of strain appeared. In 180 CE, tribes from the north raided into the province. Later, during the political turmoil of the 3rd century, Londinium found itself both a refuge and a prize in a fractured empire. In 286 CE, a Roman naval commander named Carausius declared himself emperor in Britain. Londinium became his stronghold, minting coins in his name. Though Rome eventually reconquered Britain under Emperor Constantius in 296 CE, the episode revealed the city's importance as both a strategic and symbolic center. By the late 3rd century, Londinium faced a new threat: seaborne raiders. Saxon pirates from across the North Sea struck the British coast. In response, around 200 to 225 CE, Roman engineers built massive defensive walls around Londinium. Sections of these walls still stand today, woven into the fabric of the City of London. Rising to 6 meters high and nearly 3 kilometers in length, they enclosed some 330 acres, protecting Londinium from invaders and rebellions alike. In the 4th century, Londinium entered its twilight as a Roman city. Christianity began to take hold. Evidence of early churches, perhaps including one dedicated to St. Paul, emerges from this period. Bishops from Londinium are recorded at councils in Gaul, a sign of the city's integration into the wider Christian world. Yet decline was setting in. The Roman Empire itself faltered under external invasions and internal decay. By the 360s, Londinium faced repeated raids from Saxons, Picts, and Scots. Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian, described the city, which he called Augusta, as bustling with merchants, though increasingly threatened by instability. By the early 5th century, Rome withdrew its legions from Britain. Around 410 CE, the Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Britain, advising them to see to their own defense. With that, Roman authority in Londinium ended. The once great capital began to wither. Its population declined, its forums and basilicas fell silent, its bridges collapsed. The city, which had risen from a trading post to the capital of Britannia, was largely abandoned. For centuries, the Roman walls would stand as ruins, their stones scavenged by later generations. And yet, Londinium left behind a legacy that would shape the city forever. The grid of streets beneath the modern financial district, the riverfront quays buried beneath skyscrapers, the walls that still rise beside Tower Hill. Roman London was never erased. It became the foundation for all that followed. From ashes, Londinium had risen after Boudica's fury. From fire, it had been rebuilt again and again. Now, abandoned to time, it awaited the next chapter of its story. When the last Roman legions withdrew from Britain in 410 CE, the settlement of Londinium stood as a hollowed-out shell of its former grandeur. Its wharves along the Thames lay in decay, its forum silent, and its once bustling amphitheater crumbling into disuse. The Roman administration, which had tied Britain to the vast machinery of empire, was gone. In its place, the native Britons faced a new world, vulnerable, fragmented, and open to waves of incoming peoples who would reshape the destiny of London forever. The centuries that followed Rome's withdrawal are often called the Dark Ages, a term modern historians now use with caution. While much of Roman urban life declined, these centuries were not devoid of life, change, or significance. London itself almost vanished from the map, only to be reborn in a form that would carry it toward the medieval and modern ages. Archaeological evidence suggests that after Rome's departure, Londinium was largely abandoned. The great stone walls, still standing today in fragments, may have enclosed little more than ruins and scattered squatter communities. Instead, settlement shifted upriver to a site near modern-day Aldwych and Covent Garden. This became known as Londonwick, the trading town of the Londoners. Founded by Anglo-Saxon settlers likely of the Middle Saxon Kingdom, Londonwick emerged in the 7th century CE, almost 2 centuries after Rome's collapse. The Saxons were not city builders in the Roman sense. Their settlement was less monumental, more organic, composed of timber halls, thatched roofs, and small workshops. Yet Londonwick thrived as a port and trading hub. Located just west of the old Roman city, it had access to the Thames but avoided the shadow of Roman ruins. Merchants came from the Frankish kingdoms, bringing glassware, pottery, and wine. In return, London's markets exported wool, hides, and slaves. By the 8th century, the settlement had grown into one of the most important ports in Anglo-Saxon England, home to several thousand people. Religion was central to this rebirth. In 604 CE, Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory the Great to convert the English, consecrated Mellitus as the first bishop of London. A wooden church, the forerunner of St. Paul's Cathedral, was established within the old Roman walls. Christianity's spread gave London a new spiritual center, anchoring it in the wider Christian world of Europe. Yet this fragile prosperity was destined to be tested by waves of violence that would leave scars across the city. The first recorded Viking attack on London came in 842 CE, when Danish raiders struck the port with sudden, devastating force. The Saxon Chronicle records that great slaughter was made. A few decades later, in 851 CE, a fleet of 350 Viking ships sailed up the Thames, attacking both Canterbury and London. The Anglo-Saxons rallied under King Ethelwulf of Wessex, who defeated them at the Battle of Aclea. But the raids continued, sporadic at first, then more systematic, as Norse ambitions shifted from plunder to conquest. By the late 9th century, Viking armies, the so-called Great Heathen Army, swept across England, conquering the kingdom of the East Angles and seizing much of Mercia. London, lying in a border zone between Wessex and the Danelaw, became a prize contested by both sides. In 871 CE, the year that Alfred the Great came to the throne of Wessex, the Vikings again captured and plundered London. For several years, it remained in their hands. It was Alfred who grasped the strategic significance of London. In 886 CE, after victories over the Danes, Alfred recaptured the settlement and refortified it within the old Roman walls. He shifted the focus of life back from Londonwick into the ancient city, now called Londonburg. The Roman walls, still formidable, were repaired and strengthened. Streets were reorganized, churches rebuilt, and markets restored. Alfred's decision not only revived the urban life of London, but also set in motion the city's long rise as a fortified, permanent center of power. Under Alfred and his successors, London grew into the largest and richest city in England. Its prosperity attracted merchants from across Europe, who sailed up the Thames with goods from as far afield as the Rhineland and Flanders. The city became the seat of a mint, producing coins stamped with the king's image. By the 10th century, London was surpassing Winchester as the commercial heart of the realm. But Viking ambitions did not cease. In 994 CE, a great fleet led by Olaf Tryggvason of Norway and Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark sailed against London. The attack failed, thanks in part to the stout defenses and the presence of King Athelred II, remembered by history as the Unready. Yet repeated Viking campaigns in the following years brought devastation across southern England. In 1013 CE, Sweyn Forkbeard conquered the kingdom, forcing Athelred into exile. London submitted to him, though Sweyn's reign was brief. He died the following year. What followed was a turbulent period in which London stood at the heart of struggles between Saxon and Danish rulers. Eventually, in 1016 CE, Sweyn's son, Knut the Great, secured the throne, ruling England as part of a North Sea empire that stretched to Denmark and Norway. Under Knut, London prospered again, its merchants benefiting from wide-ranging Scandinavian trade networks. But when the Danish line faltered in 1042, the throne returned to the House of Wessex under Edward the Confessor. Edward's reign brought one of the most iconic monuments of medieval London, Westminster Abbey. Begun in the 1040s and consecrated in 1065, just a week before Edward's death, the abbey became both a royal burial place and the site of coronations. Its construction, in the Romanesque style, symbolized London's emergence not only as a commercial hub, but also as a political and spiritual capital. By the mid-11th century, London had transformed from a near-abandoned ruin into a thriving city of perhaps 10,000 to 12,000 people, the largest in England. Its streets bustled with traders, its wharves were crowded with ships, and its skyline bristled with wooden churches and stone halls. Yet London's fate would once again be decided by conquest. In 1066 CE, following the death of Edward the Confessor, England faced the rival claims of Harold Godwin's son, William of Normandy, and Harold Hardrada of Norway. After Harold's death at Hastings, William advanced toward London. The city initially prepared to resist, but pragmatism prevailed. On December 25, 1066, William was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. London had shifted hands once again, but this time, its role as the beating heart of England was beyond dispute. From this point forward, no ruler could claim the English crown without being crowned in London. Thus, between Rome's fall and the Norman conquest, London weathered abandonment, rebirth, Viking fire, and Saxon resilience. Each upheaval shaped its character, a city scarred but never silenced, always adapting, always enduring. The Saxon centuries had made London a city worth fighting for, a city too valuable to be ignored. In the centuries that followed, it would become not only the seat of kings but the stage upon which the destiny of England itself would be played. When William of Normandy was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, in the newly built Westminster Abbey, the echoes of the ceremony reached far beyond the abbey walls. They reverberated through London, binding the city more tightly than ever before to the fate of kings. London's leaders had submitted to William after Harold's defeat at Hastings, and in return, William recognized the city's importance as England's commercial and political heart. The Norman conquest was not simply a change of dynasty. It marked the beginning of profound transformations in the city's architecture, governance, and identity. One of William's first acts was to secure London with a new fortress, the Tower of London. Construction began in 1078, with the White Tower at its core, built of stone imported from Normandy. Rising stark and imposing above the Thames, the tower symbolized Norman military dominance and royal authority. Over the centuries, it would serve as a fortress, palace, treasury, and prison, a visible reminder to Londoners that their fate rested in the hands of kings. London under the Normans quickly became the largest and wealthiest city in England, surpassing Winchester as the seat of royal administration. By the late 11th century, it may have held around 15,000 to 20,000 inhabitants, a staggering number compared to most towns in medieval Europe. Its wealth flowed from trade. Ships crowded the Thames, bringing wool, wine, fish, and exotic goods from Flanders, France, and beyond. London's merchants formed a powerful class, and their influence grew steadily in the centuries that followed. By the early 12th century, the city's autonomy was confirmed by a series of royal charters. In 1132, King Henry I granted London the right to elect its own sheriff and later its own mayor. This was revolutionary. It gave the citizens of London a measure of self-rule unknown elsewhere in England. The position of Mayor of London, established in 1189, evolved into one of the most important civic offices in Europe. The city's governance centered on the Guildhall, where London's guilds, associations of merchants and craftsmen, wielded immense influence. The medieval city was not only an economic engine, but also a religious center. After the original wooden St. Paul's Cathedral burned in 1087, it was rebuilt on a monumental scale. The new stone cathedral, completed in the 12th century, dominated London's skyline with its soaring spire, which, at nearly 500 feet, was the tallest structure in England. St. Paul's became the heart of religious life, hosting services, processions, and even public assemblies in its vast nave. Life in medieval London, however, was not without hardship. The city's wooden houses, crammed tightly within narrow streets, were vulnerable to fire. A great blaze in 1135 destroyed much of the city, forcing widespread rebuilding. Sanitation was poor. Refuse and waste were often dumped into the Thames or onto the streets. Yet despite the dangers, London grew, its population swelling to perhaps 40,000 by the 13th century, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. London was also drawn into the political upheavals of medieval England. During the Anarchy, 1135 to 1153, the civil war between Stephen and Matilda, Londoners played a decisive role. The city's merchants and aldermen often backed whichever claimant seemed most likely to protect their privileges. In 1215, when King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, London stood firmly with the barons, opening its gates to them in open rebellion against the king. London's support was crucial in securing the charter, which enshrined the principle that the monarch was bound by law. The reign of Henry III, 1216 to 1272, brought both turmoil and architectural splendor. Henry rebuilt Westminster Abbey in the Gothic style, beginning in 1245, creating the magnificent church that survives today. Meanwhile, tensions between the crown and the city's merchants simmered. Londoners frequently clashed with royal authority, demanding greater rights and liberties. Yet the city's wealth made it indispensable. No king could afford to alienate London completely. In 1264, during the Second Barons' War, London again became a center of rebellion. Citizens supported Simon de Montfort against Henry III, and the city endured brutal reprisals after Montfort's defeat. These episodes highlighted London's dual role, both a loyal capital and a restless, sometimes rebellious, power in its own right. The 14th century brought both prosperity and catastrophe. Under Edward I and Edward III, London flourished as a center of England's wool trade. The export of raw wool and cloth to Flanders fueled enormous wealth. Foreign merchants, Italians, Flemings, and Hanseatic traders established bases in the city. London's role in finance also grew, as Italian banking families such as the Bardi and Peruzzi lent money to kings and merchants alike. Yet beneath this prosperity lay tensions. The rigid guild system excluded many workers, and poverty was rife in the overcrowded suburbs outside the city walls. In 1348, disaster struck in the form of the Black Death. The plague, arriving by ship, spread swiftly through London's streets. Contemporary accounts speak of carts piled high with corpses, mass graves dug in churchyards, and whole households swept away in days. Estimates suggest that perhaps 40 to 60% of London's population perished in the first outbreak. The impact was devastating. Trade collapsed, rents fell, and labor shortages disrupted every aspect of city life. Yet in the long term, the plague reshaped London's society. Survivors found greater opportunities, wages rose, and the rigid structures of medieval society began to loosen. By 1348, as the plague receded, London stood at a crossroads. It had endured conquest, fire, rebellion, and pestilence. Its skyline was marked by the Tower of London, St. Paul's Cathedral, and Westminster Abbey, monuments of royal and religious power. Its people had fought for liberties that foreshadowed the constitutional struggles to come. And though the Black Death had left the city scarred, it had not destroyed it. London remained the beating heart of England, a city too vital, too resilient, to be silenced. The medieval centuries had forged London's identity, a city of wealth and commerce, of faith and politics, of resilience in the face of catastrophe. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance and Reformation, London would rise again, stronger than before, ready to shape not only the destiny of England but of the wider world. When the Black Death struck London in 1348, the city was devastated. Whole parishes vanished, churchyards overflowed, and fields of mass graves scarred the landscape. Yet in the years that followed, London demonstrated its characteristic resilience. Though tens of thousands had perished, survivors found opportunity in the ruins. Wages rose as labor became scarce, merchants found new openings in trade, and the city slowly rebuilt itself. By the late 14th century, London's population had begun to recover, and its influence as England's foremost city grew stronger than ever. The plague did not end after the first outbreak. Recurrences struck in 1361, 1369, and 1375, each time taking thousands of lives. But despite this cycle of death, London expanded. Immigration from the countryside flowed steadily into the city, replacing those lost. By the 15th century, London's population stood at roughly 50,000 to 60,000, making it the largest city in England by a wide margin. Its dominance was reinforced by the wool and cloth trade, which remained the backbone of England's medieval economy. Politically, the late medieval era was a time of turbulence, and London often stood at the center of national drama. In 1381, the city became a flashpoint during the Peasants' Revolt. Sparked by resentment over taxes and social restrictions, rebels led by Wat Tyler marched on London. They stormed the Tower of London, executed royal officials, and demanded sweeping reforms. For several days, London teetered on the edge of chaos until King Richard II, then only 14 years old, met the rebels at Smithfield. The revolt was crushed, but it revealed both the volatility of London's masses and the symbolic importance of the city in England's political struggles. The 15th century brought new crises. During the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1487, London played a decisive role. Control of the capital often determined control of the crown. In 1461, Edward, Duke of York, entered London and was proclaimed Edward IV, despite ongoing battles in the countryside. Later, in 1471, Edward regained the city after defeating the Lancastrians at Barnet and Tewkesbury. The political instability of these years highlighted London's importance. No ruler could claim legitimacy without London's support. Despite the turmoil, London's commercial life thrived. The city's guilds, known as the livery companies, regulated trade, maintained standards, and wielded political power. Their halls, some of which still survive, became centers of civic life. London Bridge, rebuilt in stone during the late 12th century, remained the only permanent crossing of the Thames, lined with houses and shops that turned it into a bustling thoroughfare. The Guildhall, rebuilt in the 15th century, stood as a symbol of civic pride and authority. By the end of the medieval era, London's character had been forged, a city of merchants and craftsmen, churches and markets, narrow lanes and crowded houses. But in the 16th century, Under the Tudor dynasty, London would transform again, this time into the heart of a rising imperial power. The accession of Henry VII in 1485, following the victory at Bosworth Field, ended decades of dynastic conflict. The Tudors recognized London's importance and cultivated it as the engine of their new monarchy. Under Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, the city entered an era of monumental change. Henry's reign brought both splendor and upheaval. He expanded royal palaces along the Thames, including Whitehall, Greenwich, and Hampton Court, turning London into a center of royal magnificence. But Henry is best remembered for his break with Rome. In the 1530s, his dispute with the Pope over his marriage to Catherine of Aragon led to the English Reformation. In London, this revolution reshaped the city's landscape. Monasteries that had dominated the medieval skyline, such as Blackfriars, Greyfriars, and Charterhouse, were dissolved, their lands confiscated, their buildings torn down or repurposed. The dissolution transformed London physically and economically, as vast tracts of land were opened to development. Merchants and courtiers acquired these properties, fueling a new wave of urban expansion. Religious upheaval also brought persecution and violence. Under Mary I, 1553 to 1558, attempts to restore Catholicism led to the burning of Protestants at Smithfield, where hundreds were executed. Under her half-sister Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, Protestantism was re-established and London became a bastion of the new Anglican Church. Elizabeth's reign, though turbulent, ushered in what is often remembered as a golden age for London. By Elizabeth's time, the city had grown dramatically. Its population swelled from around 50,000 in 1500 to over 200,000 by 1600. This explosive growth brought prosperity, but also strain. Streets became more crowded, sanitation worsened, and outbreaks of plague returned with deadly regularity. In 1563, for example, the plague killed an estimated 20,000 Londoners, a tenth of the city's population. Despite such calamities, London's expansion continued, spreading into suburbs like Southwark, Shoreditch, and Westminster. Economically, London was becoming the hub of an emerging global network. The Muscovy Company, 1555, the Levant Company, 1581, and later the East India Company, 1600, established London merchants as pioneers of overseas trade. Ships sailed from the Thames to Russia, the Mediterranean, and eventually to Asia and the Americas. The wealth generated from these ventures began to lay the foundations of London's later imperial power. Culturally, Tudor London was a city alive with creativity. The dissolution of monasteries freed space for new uses, and the growth of printing after William Caxton introduced the press in 1476 turned London into England's publishing capital. Playhouses such as the Theatre, 1576, and the Curtain, 1577, opened in the northern suburbs, and in 1599, the Globe Theatre was built on the Bankside. There, the plays of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson drew vast crowds, from commoners in the pit to nobles in the galleries. Theaters, however, were controversial. Authorities feared disorder and disease, and Puritans denounced them as sinful. Yet they flourished, reflecting both the vitality and tensions of Elizabethan society. Music, art, and literature all thrived, supported by a city whose wealth and population provided an eager audience. London was also the stage for dramatic political moments. In 1588, as the Spanish Armada threatened invasion, Londoners prepared for defense. Elizabeth herself rallied troops at Tilbury, declaring she had the heart and stomach of a king. The Armada's defeat boosted London's confidence as the capital of a Protestant nation. Elizabethan London, however, was a city of contrasts. While the wealthy built grand houses, many lived in poverty, crammed into unhealthy alleys. Crime was rife, and punishment brutal. Executions at Tyburn drew vast crowds, while traitors' heads were displayed on London Bridge as warnings. Yet, even amidst hardship, London was a city of opportunity, drawing migrants from across England and beyond. When Elizabeth died in 1603, she left behind a transformed London. From a medieval city scarred by plague and rebellion, it had become a bustling metropolis, a center of trade, culture, and politics, with a population larger than Paris or Rome. Its streets echoed with the sounds of merchants bargaining, apprentices shouting, and actors reciting lines on makeshift stages. Its river was crowded with ships, carrying goods and ambitions that stretched far beyond England's shores. By the dawn of the 17th century, London stood poised to become not only the capital of England, but the heart of a rising global empire. The centuries ahead would bring fire, plague, and revolution, but also expansion, innovation, and power on a scale the medieval city could scarcely have imagined. When James VI of Scotland rode south in 1603 to inherit the English throne as James I, following the death of Elizabeth I, London entered a new era. For the first time, the crowns of England and Scotland were united under one monarch. The Jacobean period marked the beginning of the Stuart dynasty, and with it came dramatic transformations in London's politics, society, and urban landscape. The city, already the largest in Europe, would continue to grow in wealth and population, but it would also become the stage for religious conflict, civil war, plague, and fire. By 1603, London's population had reached around 200,000, dwarfing every other English town. By 1650, it would surpass 400,000, a scale unprecedented in the kingdom. This explosive growth created both opportunity and strain. The Thames bustled with ships trading to the Mediterranean, Africa, and the Americas. New suburban districts, Holborn, Clerkenwell, Whitechapel, Southwark, sprawled outward from the medieval walls. Wealthy courtiers and merchants erected grand houses, while the poor crowded into alleys and tenements, their lives precarious and unsanitary. The Stuart kings expanded London's role as the seat of monarchy. James I preferred the Palace of Whitehall, while also using Greenwich and Hampton Court. He encouraged the arts, sponsoring playwrights such as William Shakespeare and Ben Jonson. Theaters thrived, though Puritans condemned them as dens of immorality. In 1605, London was rocked by the Gunpowder Plot, when Catholic conspirators attempted to blow up Parliament and the king. Their failure, commemorated annually on November 5th, reflected the deep religious tensions that ran through the city. Commerce continued to transform London. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, expanded its reach into Asia, bringing spices, silks, and porcelain to London's markets. Coffee houses, first appearing in the 1650s, became places where merchants exchanged news and conducted business, foreshadowing the birth of institutions like Lloyd's of London. London's docks groaned with cargoes of sugar, tobacco, and slave products of England's growing involvement in the transatlantic trade. The city was becoming not just England's capital, but the financial hub of a rising global empire. Yet beneath this prosperity, tension festered. James I and his son, Charles I, clashed repeatedly with Parliament. Londoners, many of whom sympathized with Puritan calls for reform, grew restless under the king's insistence on royal prerogative and unpopular taxation. The situation boiled over in the 1640s. When civil war erupted in 1642 between royalists and parliamentarians, London's allegiance proved decisive. The city's wealth, manpower, and strategic location gave Parliament the upper hand. London's trained bands, its citizen militia, defended the capital, and the Thames supplied the armies with provisions. Charles I attempted to seize London early in the war, but was repelled. The city became the stronghold of Parliament, its presses printing propaganda, its streets hosting fiery sermons. The war ended with the king's defeat and trial. On January 30th, 1649, Charles I was executed outside the banqueting house at Whitehall, a shocking act that reverberated across Europe. London, once the seat of the monarchy, had witnessed the public beheading of its king. England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell, and London adapted to its new role as capital of the Commonwealth. During the interregnum, 1649 to 1660, London continued to thrive. Cromwell used the city as the base for his campaigns in Ireland and Scotland, and merchants prospered under England's expanding naval power. Yet the Puritan regime imposed restrictions on theater and entertainment, closing the playhouses that had made Elizabethan London famous. Theaters remained dark until the Restoration. When Charles II returned in 1660, London erupted in celebration. The Restoration restored the monarchy, reopened the theaters, and reinvigorated cultural life. The king granted land for new developments, and aristocrats built grand squares such as Covent Garden and Lincoln's Inn Fields. London was becoming increasingly fashionable, its elite residences reflecting the tastes of a cosmopolitan court. But this revival was soon overshadowed by catastrophe. In 1665, the city was struck by the last great outbreak of the bubonic plague. Beginning in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, it spread rapidly through London's narrow alleys and crowded houses. The disease carried by fleas-on rats swept through rich and poor alike. The diarist Samuel Pepys recorded the horrors: red crosses painted on doors to mark infected houses, the cry of "Bring out your dead," and the eerie silence of once bustling streets. The plague revealed the city's vulnerability, its overcrowding, poor sanitation, and dependence on trade routes that carried infection as well as goods. London had barely begun to recover when an even greater disaster struck. On September 2, 1666, a fire broke out in the bakery of Thomas Fariner on Pudding Lane. Fanned by strong winds, the flames spread rapidly through the wooden houses. For 4 days, the Great Fire of London consumed the city, destroying over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and most of the medieval core. St. Paul's Cathedral, its timber scaffolding ignited, collapsed in ruins. By the time the fire was extinguished, some 70,000 of London's 80,000 inhabitants had been left homeless. Yet remarkably, official records report relatively few deaths, though the true toll is debated. The fire cleared away much of the city's medieval fabric, leaving a blank slate for rebuilding. The devastation was immense, but once again, London's resilience prevailed. Plans for reconstruction emerged almost immediately. Visionaries such as Sir Christopher Wren proposed grand boulevards and classical squares, though most schemes were too ambitious to realize. Still, Wren's designs would shape the new London, particularly through his rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral, begun in 1675. By the end of 1666, London had endured plague, war, regicide, and fire, yet it survived. Each catastrophe reshaped the city, forcing adaptation and innovation. The medieval timber lanes had given way to wider streets and brick buildings. The monarchy had been toppled and restored. London's population, though scarred, would soon surge again. The capital was entering a new era, the age of coffee houses, finance, and empire, when London would emerge as the heart of a global power. When the smoke cleared in the autumn of 1666, London lay in ruins. The Great Fire had reduced the medieval heart of the city to ash, sweeping away thousands of timber-framed houses, markets, and warehouses. Whole parishes vanished overnight, their churches left as blackened shells. Of the 80,000 residents within the old city walls, nearly 70,000 were homeless. Yet, in a pattern that would become characteristic of London's long history, disaster was followed by resilience and renewal. The fire, though devastating, offered an opportunity to rebuild the capital on firmer, more modern foundations. The king, Charles II, took a personal interest in the reconstruction. Within days, architects, surveyors, and visionaries presented bold new plans. Among them, Sir Christopher Wren proposed a radical redesign of London along classical lines, boulevards, grand piazzas, and sweeping vistas reminiscent of Paris or Rome. Yet such ambitious visions proved impractical. Londoners, eager to return to their businesses and homes, resisted large-scale demolitions. Property rights, jealously guarded, made sweeping reforms impossible. In practice, the city was rebuilt largely on its medieval street plan. But significant changes did occur. Parliament passed the Rebuilding Act of 1667, mandating that new houses be constructed from brick or stone, not timber, to reduce fire risk. Streets were widened, alleys straightened, and open spaces such as Cheapside and Fleet Street were cleared of encroachments. Londoners accepted modest improvements rather than a total transformation. The most visible symbol of rebirth was Wren's masterpiece, the new St. Paul's Cathedral. Begun in 1675 and completed in 1710, its soaring dome rose above the skyline, proclaiming London's recovery. Wren also rebuilt over 50 parish churches, each a jewel of Baroque architecture. The city that emerged from the ashes was more ordered, more fire-resistant, and increasingly monumental. Yet rebuilding was only part of the story. The late 17th century saw London transform into a hub of commerce, culture, and imperial ambition. The Royal Exchange, founded earlier by Sir Thomas Gresham, became the beating heart of trade, where merchants and financiers brokered deals with partners across the globe. London's docks bustled with ships carrying sugar from the Caribbean, spices from India, and furs from North America. Behind this wealth lay darker currents. The transatlantic slave trade, in which London merchants invested heavily, reaping enormous profits from human suffering. By the 1670s and 1680s, London was a leading center of the English slave trade, with companies like the Royal African Company chartered to supply enslaved Africans to the colonies. The intellectual and social life of the city also flourished. Coffee houses, first introduced in the 1650s, spread rapidly. By 1700, London boasted hundreds of them. These establishments served not only coffee but also news, gossip, and debate. Each attracted its clientele. Merchants gathered at Lloyd's Coffee House, where the first marine insurance contracts were struck. Writers met at Will's Coffee House. Politicians schemed at others. The diarist Samuel Pepys and later Daniel Defoe observed how coffee houses democratized knowledge, creating a penny university where men of all classes could exchange ideas. This atmosphere fostered institutions that would shape London's role as a financial capital. In 1694, the Bank of England was founded to stabilize public credit and finance wars against France. Its headquarters in Threadneedle Street became a cornerstone of Britain's fiscal military state, enabling the government to borrow vast sums and project power overseas. The stock exchange began informally in Jonathan's Coffee House, where traders gathered to buy and sell shares in joint stock companies. London was evolving into the financial nerve center of an emerging empire. The late Stuart period was also marked by political upheaval. The reign of Charles II was followed by his brother, James II, whose open Catholicism provoked fierce opposition in Protestant London. In 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution unfolded when William of Orange and his wife, Mary, were invited to take the throne. Londoners largely welcomed William, and James II fled into exile. The revolution confirmed Parliament's supremacy over the crown and established Protestant succession as a constitutional principle. London, once the scene of regicide, now witnessed a bloodless transfer of power that reshaped English governance. The city's cultural life reflected these changes. Theaters, closed during the Puritan era, now flourished with royal patronage. The Restoration stage produced comedies of manners by writers like William Congreve and Aphra Behn, one of the first professional female playwrights. Book publishing thrived, supported by the Stationers' Company and a rising literate middle class. In 1702, the first daily newspaper, the Daily Courant, was printed in Fleet Street, heralding the rise of modern journalism. Meanwhile, London's population continued to grow. By 1700, it exceeded 575,000, making it the largest city in Europe after Paris. Growth spilled into new suburbs. Westminster, where government and aristocracy clustered, Southwark, known for its markets and theaters, and Spitalfields, where waves of Huguenot refugees from France established a weaving industry. London was increasingly cosmopolitan, shaped by migrants who brought skills, languages, and faiths. Yet rapid growth brought problems. The city struggled with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and periodic outbreaks of disease. Streets were often choked with refuse, and the Thames, polluted with sewage, stank in summer. Crime flourished in the rookeries, labyrinths of alleys where the poor struggled to survive. The contrast between wealth and poverty became ever starker, foreshadowing social tensions that would define the 18th century. By the death of Queen and in 1714, London had become the undisputed capital of Britain and the empire it was forging. The Union of England and Scotland in 1707 created the Kingdom of Great Britain, with London as its seat of government. The city was not only the largest in the Isles, but also the center of finance, culture, and imperial administration. The accession of the Hanoverian dynasty, beginning with George I, would usher in a new phase of London's story, one in which the city's influence extended across oceans and continents. Through fire and plague, revolution and rebuilding, London had emerged stronger. Its skyline was transformed by domes and spires, its streets alive with merchants, coffee-house debates, and newspapers. From the ashes of 1666, a new London had risen, a city no longer merely medieval but unmistakably modern, poised to dominate the 18th century as the heart of a global empire. The death of Queen and in 1714 brought the Stuart dynasty to an end and ushered in the Hanoverian era. With the accession of George I, London entered a period that would redefine its architecture, politics, culture, and society. It was an age of elegance and enlightenment, but also of stark inequality and rapid transformation. The city expanded beyond its medieval walls to become the undisputed heart of Britain's empire, commerce, and intellectual life. By the early 18th century, London was already the largest city in Britain, with nearly 600,000 inhabitants. By 1801, when the first national census was taken, its population had more than doubled to over 900,000. And by 1831, it reached 1.6 million, making it the largest city in the world. This explosive growth was fueled by migration from the countryside, waves of foreign immigrants, and the steady influx of wealth generated by the empire. London became not just a capital, but a metropolis. One of the most visible legacies of the Georgian era was its architecture. Vast new residential squares and terraces reshaped the urban landscape. In Bloomsbury, the Bedford estate laid out elegant squares such as Russell Square and Bedford Square, lined with harmonious rows of brick townhouses. In Mayfair and Marylebone, aristocrats built grand houses facing communal gardens, reflecting a new emphasis on order and proportion. The Georgian style, with its symmetry and restraint, created neighborhoods that remain some of London's most desirable today. At the same time, London's cultural institutions flourished. In 1753, the British Museum was founded through the bequest of Sir Hans Sloane, a physician and collector whose vast assemblage of books, manuscripts, and curiosities formed the core of the collection. The museum embodied the Enlightenment spirit, the belief that human knowledge could be gathered, cataloged, and made available for public study. In 1755, Samuel Johnson published his monumental Dictionary of the English Language from his house in Gough Square, establishing standards for English vocabulary and usage. London was also the stage for political debate and print culture. Newspapers and pamphlets proliferated, feeding a voracious reading public. Coffee houses remained centers of discussion, but clubs also emerged, such as White's and Brooks's and St. James's, where aristocrats and politicians gathered. The press gained new freedoms after the lapse of pre-publication censorship in 1695, and by the mid-18th century, London was home to dozens of newspapers, making it the most vibrant print culture in Europe. The Enlightenment spirit fostered scientific discovery as well. The Royal Society, founded in the 17th century, continued to meet in London, publishing experiments and findings. The city was also the workplace of innovators like James Watt, whose improvements to the steam engine helped launch the Industrial Revolution. London became a nexus of invention, industry, and ideas, even as it grappled with the challenges these forces unleashed. Yet the Georgian era was not solely one of elegance and progress. It was also a time of grinding poverty and stark inequality. While aristocrats and wealthy merchants lived in townhouses adorned with stucco facades and neoclassical columns, the poor crowded into rookeries like Street Giles and Seven Dials, where squalor, crime, and disease were endemic. Gin, cheap and widely available by the 1720s, fueled addiction and disorder. William Hogarth's famous engravings, Gin Lane, 1751, and Beer Street, contrasted the destructive effects of gin with the supposed wholesomeness of beer. The Gin Acts of 1736 and 1751 sought to curb consumption, but the image of drunken Londoners became a defining feature of the city in this era. Crime was another pressing concern. Highwaymen and pickpockets preyed on travelers and city dwellers alike. In response, Henry Fielding, novelist and magistrate, established the Bow Street Runners in 1749, often regarded as London's first professional police force. Courts at the Old Bailey tried thousands each year, with punishments ranging from transportation to Australia to public executions at Tyburn, where crowds gathered to watch criminals hanged. Justice was harsh and public, reflecting both the anxieties of a growing metropolis and the spectacle of authority. London was also shaped profoundly by the Empire. The city's docks at Wapping, Deptford, and later the West India docks on the Isle of Dogs became the arteries of imperial commerce. Ships unloaded sugar, tea, tobacco, coffee, and cotton, feeding London's insatiable markets. But this wealth was inseparable from the transatlantic slave trade, in which London financiers, insurers, and merchants were deeply implicated. Companies headquartered in London profited enormously from slavery, even as abolitionist voices grew louder. Figures like Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, and later William Wilberforce found allies in London churches and societies. The city became both a hub of pro-slavery wealth and the crucible of abolitionist activism. When the Slave Trade Act was passed in 1807, and slavery itself was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, London's role as both profiteer and reformer was clear. Culturally, the Georgian period saw the rise of London as a global center of theater, literature, and art. The theaters of Drury Lane and Covent Garden staged works by playwrights such as Richard Brinsley Sheridan, while novelists like Henry Fielding, Samuel Richardson, and later Jane Austen found eager readers among London's middle classes. The painter William Hogarth depicted both the vices and virtues of London life, while the poet William Blake walked its streets, envisioning chartered streets and dark satanic mills. Religion, too, was reshaped in this era. The Methodist movement, founded by John Wesley and George Whitefield, attracted large followings in London. Wesley's Chapel and City Road became the heart of a movement that emphasized personal piety, social reform, and outreach to the poor. Meanwhile, The established Church of England continued to wield influence, but dissenting congregations multiplied, reflecting London's growing religious diversity. By the early 19th century, London was undergoing the first stirrings of industrial transformation. Steam engines powered factories, canals, and later railways linked the city to the rest of the country, and new working-class districts expanded to house migrants drawn by opportunity. Yet with growth came challenges: pollution, overcrowding, and disease. Epidemics of cholera and typhus swept through London in the 1830s, revealing the limits of its infrastructure. The Georgian period ended with the death of William IV in 1837 and the accession of Queen Victoria. By then, London was poised to enter its most dramatic phase of expansion and change. It had grown from a medieval city rebuilt after fire to the largest metropolis in the world, a hub of finance, culture, and empire. The Georgian legacy remained visible in its architecture, institutions, and intellectual life, but new forces of industrialization, social reform, and imperial power would propel London into the Victorian age. The accession of Queen Victoria in 1837 marked the beginning of an age of extraordinary growth and transformation for London. When she came to the throne, the city already held more than 2 million inhabitants, making it the largest urban center on Earth. By the time of her death in 1901, London's population had surged to over 6.5 million, sprawling far beyond the old city boundaries into new suburbs, rail-linked districts, and industrial neighborhoods. It was a century of invention and ambition, but also of poverty, pollution, and profound inequality. At the heart of Victorian London stood industry. The Industrial Revolution, already underway in Britain, reshaped the capital into a city powered by steam, railways, and factories. Coal smoke darkened the skies, giving rise to the infamous London fogs, thick yellow smogs that blanketed the city for days. The River Thames, choked with industrial waste and raw sewage, became a health hazard. In the summer of 1858, the Great Stink forced Parliament itself to suspend business, prompting the government to finally commission the engineer Joseph Bazalgette to construct an extensive sewer system. Completed in the 1860s, Bazalgette's network not only curbed disease, but also laid the foundation for modern London's sanitation. Transport was revolutionized. The railways transformed the geography of the city, bringing in commuters from the suburbs and goods from across the country. New stations such as Euston, 1837, King's Cross, 1852, and St. Pancras, 1868, became vast cathedrals of iron and glass. In 1863, London pioneered the world's first underground railway, the Metropolitan Line, tunneling beneath the streets from Paddington to Farringdon. By the century's end, the underground had expanded into a network that redefined urban movement and set a model for cities worldwide. Victorian London also became a city of monumental architecture. The destruction of the old Palace of Westminster by fire in 1834 led to the construction of the new Houses of Parliament, designed by Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin in the Gothic Revival style. Completed in the 1870s, crowned by Big Ben, the building embodied Victorian confidence and imperial identity. Across the city, museums, galleries, and civic buildings reflected the era's faith in progress and public knowledge. The Natural History Museum, 1881, the Science Museum, and the Victoria and Albert Museum all rose in South Kensington, funded in part by the profits of empire. Yet beneath these monuments lay a city of stark contrasts. While the West End glittered with theaters, shops, and grand boulevards, the East End housed London's poorest. Districts such as Whitechapel and Spitalfields were overcrowded and unsanitary, home to recent immigrants, casual laborers, and the unemployed. Reports like Henry Mayhew's London Labor and the London Poor, 1851, exposed the harsh realities of urban poverty. Social reformers campaigned for change, but conditions remained desperate for many. Crime became a notorious feature of Victorian London. The Metropolitan Police, founded in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel, patrolled the streets in their blue uniforms, giving rise to the nickname Bobbies. Yet sensational crimes captured the public imagination. In 1888, the murders of women in Whitechapel by the unidentified Jack the Ripper exposed the brutality of life in the slums and the failure of the police to protect the vulnerable. The case drew international attention and became one of the most infamous mysteries in criminal history. Cultural life thrived amid these tensions. London became a hub for literature, music, and theater. Writers such as Charles Dickens chronicled the city's contradictions in novels like Oliver Twist, 1837, and Bleak House, 1853, blending vivid description with social critique. Dickens' depictions of orphans, debtors' prisons, and fog-bound streets shaped the world's image of Victorian London. Meanwhile, the West End developed into a theater district, and concert halls like the Royal Albert Hall, opened in 1871, drew audiences from all classes. The Victorian period was also marked by waves of immigration. Irish migrants fleeing the Great Famine of the 1840s settled in districts like Camden and Lambeth. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe arrived later in the century, especially in Whitechapel, bringing new cultural influences. These communities enriched London's diversity, but also faced prejudice and hardship. London's global role grew ever larger. It became the administrative and financial capital of the British Empire, from which vast territories across Asia, Africa, and the Americas were governed. The City of London, with its banks and trading houses, handled a growing share of the world's finance. The docks expanded to accommodate the enormous flow of goods, making London not only the world's largest city, but also its busiest port. The century closed with a flourish of imperial celebration. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, displayed Britain's industrial and artistic achievements to millions of visitors from around the world. Later jubilees celebrated Victoria's reign itself, cementing her as the figurehead of a global empire on which the sun never set. Yet the contradictions of Victorian London remained unresolved. It was a city of grandeur and destitution, of innovation and inequality, of empire and exploitation. Its monuments and institutions projected confidence, but its rookeries and slums revealed fragility. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, London stood at the height of its global power, yet on the cusp of new challenges that would define the modern age. The death of Queen Victoria in January 1901 marked the end of an age and the beginning of a new one. Her son, Edward VII, was crowned king later that year, ushering in what we now call the Edwardian era. Though brief, lasting only until Edward died in 1910 and the accession of his son George V, this period cast a distinctive imprint on London's history. It was an age of elegance, optimism, and spectacle, but beneath its glittering surface, the foundations of crisis were already forming. By 1901, London's population had swelled to over 6.5 million, making it the largest city in the world. Its sheer size was staggering. The city spread far beyond the medieval core and Georgian squares, spilling into new suburbs that extended deep into Middlesex, Essex, Surrey, and Kent. Railways, trams, and the expanding underground carried millions of commuters into the city every day. In 1900, the Central London Railway, later known as the Central Line, opened, running from Shepherd's Bush to the Bank. Its deep tunnels represented the second generation of the Underground, built with new electric traction that freed trains from the smoke and soot of steam. The Edwardian years brought a sense of modernity. Motor cars appeared on the streets in growing numbers, competing with horse-drawn omnibuses. By 1903, the first motor bus services began, while taxis fitted with meters followed shortly after. New bridges such as Vauxhall Bridge, opened 1906, joined the older crossings over the Thames, easing congestion. Yet for all this progress, London remained a city of sharp contrasts. The grandeur of the West End stood beside the deprivation of the East End. Culturally, the Edwardian era was a high point. The West End theaters thrived, staging musical comedies, dramas, and operettas that drew fashionable audiences. The new Aldwych Theatre opened in 1905, while the London Coliseum, built in 1904, showcased spectacular music hall entertainment. Cafes, clubs, and hotels such as the Ritz and the Savoy catered to high society. This was also the age of the great department stores. Selfridges, founded in 1908 on Oxford Street, revolutionized shopping by creating a palace of glass and light that invited customers to browse freely. Art, literature, and fashion flourished in Edwardian London. The society portraitist John Singer Sargent captured the city's elite on canvas, while writers such as H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, and Virginia Woolf challenged social conventions in print. London was a city both steeped in tradition and alive with new ideas. But beneath this glittering facade lay the pressures of inequality. The East End still suffered from chronic poverty, unemployment, and overcrowding. Social investigators like Charles Booth mapped the city street by street, revealing in his 1902 survey the stark divide between wealth and want. Around 30% of Londoners lived in poverty, many in slum housing without sanitation. Child mortality rates were high, and disease was never far away. These conditions fueled political activism and reform movements. Nowhere was this more visible than in the suffragette movement. Women campaigning for the right to vote staged demonstrations across London. The Women's Social and Political Union, founded by Emmeline Pankhurst in 1903, adopted militant tactics. In 1908, more than 300,000 people gathered in Hyde Park for a mass rally demanding votes for women, one of the largest political gatherings in British history. Suffragettes chained themselves to railings, broke shop windows, and disrupted Parliament. Many were arrested and force-fed in prison, but their struggle became one of the defining features of Edwardian London. Immigration added to the city's complexity. In the early 1900s, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe settled in the East End, especially in Whitechapel and Spitalfields. They established synagogues, schools, and businesses, enriching London's culture but also facing hostility and prejudice. Political radicalism flourished in these communities. Anarchists and socialists found a foothold in London's poorer districts, reflecting the broader ferment of Europe before the First World War. Edwardian London was also a city of imperial display. In 1902, the coronation of Edward VII brought immense processions through the streets, with soldiers and dignitaries from across the empire. In 1911, George V's coronation was similarly marked by grand spectacle. London was not just Britain's capital. It was the capital of a global empire that stretched over a quarter of the Earth's landmass. The Festival of Empire in 1911 at Crystal Palace celebrated imperial unity with exhibitions from Canada, Australia, India, and Africa. Technology continued to reshape the city. In 1905, the first motor bus services began replacing horse-drawn vehicles, and by 1914, motor cars filled the main thoroughfares. Electricity lit up shops and theaters, while telephones spread through businesses and middle-class homes. London was rapidly modernizing, even as its skyline retained its historic landmarks: St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, and the Tower of London, which anchored the city in its long past. But this optimism was shadowed by growing international tension. Londoners followed the news of arms races, alliances, and crises on the continent. In 1912, the sinking of the Titanic, built in Belfast but owned by the London-based White Star Line, shocked the world and reminded Londoners of the fragility of progress. Political unrest also troubled the city. Strikes and demonstrations erupted in the docks and railways, while Irish nationalists pressed their demands for home rule, drawing large rallies in Trafalgar Square. By 1914, London's population had reached more than 7 million, still the largest city in the world. It was the financial center of the empire, a global hub of culture and politics, and a city that embodied modernity. But the summer of that year brought catastrophe. In June, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set in motion a chain of events that would plunge Europe into war. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. In London, crowds thronged Downing Street and Buckingham Palace, cheering the news. Few realized that the conflict ahead would bring devastation on a scale never before seen. Edwardian London had been a city of spectacle and contrasts, of imperial pride and social struggle, of motor cars and music halls. Now it was about to face its greatest trial, a total war that would scar the city and its people forever. The armistice of November 11, 1918, was greeted with jubilation in London. Crowds thronged Trafalgar Square, the Mall, and Buckingham Palace, cheering the end of 4 years of devastating war. Yet the victory was bittersweet. Nearly 1 million British soldiers had been killed, and tens of thousands of returning veterans filled the streets of London, some wounded, others traumatized. The city that entered the 1920s was both triumphant and deeply scarred. One of the most poignant post-war transformations was in the city's commemorations. In 1920, the cenotaph was unveiled in Whitehall, a stark monument to the fallen, while the unknown warrior was interred in Westminster Abbey. Every year on Armistice Day, Londoners paused in silence, a ritual of collective mourning that reflected the scale of loss. London in the interwar years was a city of contrasts, recovery and innovation on one hand, economic hardship and unrest on the other. The 1920s saw a surge of cultural vibrancy. Jazz clubs, cinemas, and dance halls proliferated. The Savoy Hotel became a symbol of modern glamour, hosting cabarets and lavish dinners. Theaters in the West End thrived, while the newly popular medium of cinema spread rapidly by 1929, and there were over 400 cinemas across the city. This was also the age of the wireless radio, with the BBC, founded in 1922, broadcasting from its headquarters in Savoy Hill and later Broadcasting House, opened 1932. London became a hub of modern mass culture. Yet prosperity was unevenly distributed. Large sections of the East End still struggled with poverty, unemployment, and poor housing. Waves of strikes disrupted the 1920s, culminating in the general strike of May 1926, when more than 1.5 million workers walked out in solidarity with coal miners. London ground to a halt. Buses stopped, trains were suspended, and newspapers failed to publish. Volunteers, including middle-class professionals and students, attempted to keep essential services running, but the strike highlighted deep divides between labor and government. Transport defined much of London's interwar development. The Underground expanded with the Piccadilly line extensions reaching Cockfosters in the north and Hounslow in the west by the early 1930s. In 1933, the various private underground companies were consolidated into the London Passenger Transport Board, creating the unified London transport system that introduced the famous roundel logo and red Routemaster buses that became symbols of the city. The construction of new arterial roads, as well as Waterloo Bridge, rebuilt beginning in 1934, sought to manage the growing number of motor cars that now filled London's streets. Immigration reshaped London in new ways. In the 1920s and 1930s, communities of Afro-Caribbean seamen, Indian students, and Jewish refugees enriched the city's cosmopolitan character. The East End became home to thousands of Jewish families fleeing anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and later, refugees from Nazi Germany. Their presence brought new cultural influences but also stirred tensions. as seen in the Battle of Cable Street in October 1936, when residents, Jewish groups, and left-wing activists confronted Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. The march was blocked, and the slogan "They shall not pass" entered the city's history as a moment of defiance against rising extremism. London society in the interwar years was sharply divided. The West End glittered with high society balls, luxury hotels, and cocktail parties. Writers like Virginia Woolf and the Bloomsbury Group debated art, philosophy, and politics. Meanwhile, working-class districts faced unemployment during the Great Depression of the early 1930s. Soup kitchens, hunger marches, and mass protests marked the period, none more famous than the Jarrow March of 1936, when unemployed men walked from Tyneside to London to demand jobs. They reached the capital in November, greeted by sympathy but little concrete action from the government. Architecture and urban life reflected modern aspirations. The Battersea Power Station, begun in 1929, symbolized London's electrification, while Arno's Grove Underground Station, opened in 1932, showcased sleek modernist design. The BBC's Broadcasting House, completed in 1932, embodied the age of mass communication. Meanwhile, Wembley Stadium, built in 1923 for the British Empire exhibition, became the heart of British sport and spectacle. The political atmosphere grew increasingly anxious as the 1930s progressed. Londoners watched with alarm as fascism rose in Italy and Germany. The abdication crisis of 1936, when Edward VIII gave up the throne to Mary Wallis Simpson, captivated the public and disrupted the monarchy, though it was resolved with the accession of George VI. International tensions worsened after Hitler annexed Austria in 1938 and the Munich Agreement later that year. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich to Heston Aerodrome in West London, declaring he had secured peace for our time. Many Londoners cheered, but beneath the relief lay deep uncertainty. Londoners prepared for war. From 1937, the government organized air raid precautions, ERP, distributing gas masks and building public shelters. By 1939, trenches were dug in Hyde Park and Regent's Park. Blackout curtains were fitted across the city, and anti-aircraft defenses began to ring London. The memory of German Zeppelin raids in 1915 and Gotha bomber attacks in 1917 remained vivid, and few doubted that the next war would bring destruction from the skies. On September 3, 1939, following Germany's invasion of Poland, Britain once again declared war. In London, Prime Minister Chamberlain's grave announcement was broadcast by the BBC from Broadcasting House. Within hours, air raid sirens wailed across the capital for the first time, though no bombs fell that day. Evacuation plans swung into action. Thousands of children were sent from London to the countryside, clutching gas masks and small suitcases. The interwar years had been a time of dazzling culture and deep division, of progress in transport and communication, but also economic struggle and political unrest. London emerged from them as a city both modern and vulnerable, standing at the threshold of yet another global conflict. The years of jazz, strikes, and cinema now gave way to the long, dark shadow of the Second World War. When Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, London braced itself for an ordeal unlike anything it had ever faced. Memories of German bombing raids in the First World War were still raw, but few could yet imagine the scale of destruction that modern aerial warfare would unleash on the capital. The first months of war, often called the Phony War, passed with little incident. Londoners lived under blackout regulations, painting lampposts and curbs white to guide pedestrians in the dark, while anti-aircraft defenses dotted the parks. Children were evacuated from the city in Operation Pied Piper, beginning in September 1939. More than 1 million Londoners, mostly children, were sent to rural areas. For many families, This meant painful separations, though some children later returned as the anticipated bombing failed to materialize in the winter of 1939–40. The calm ended in September 1940. After months of German air raids on ports and airfields, Adolf Hitler ordered a sustained bombing campaign on London itself. Beginning on September 7, 1940, waves of Luftwaffe bombers struck the East End docks, igniting fires and leveling streets. This was the start of the Blitz. For 57 consecutive nights, London was bombed without pause. The sound of air raid sirens became part of daily life, sending Londoners scrambling for shelter in basements, underground stations, and makeshift bunkers. The East End, with its docks and factories, bore the brunt of early raids. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, yet the bombers ranged across the capital. The Guildhall, the Old Bailey, and even Buckingham Palace were hit. On December 29, 1940, one of the most devastating raids struck the city of London, creating the Second Great Fire of London. St. Paul's Cathedral, illuminated in the flames, narrowly survived, its dome standing defiantly amid the smoke. Photographs of the cathedral that night became a powerful symbol of resilience. Life during the Blitz was marked by hardship and extraordinary endurance. Over 30,000 Londoners were killed, and tens of thousands more were injured. Families lived with the constant threat of death and destruction. Many took shelter in the underground, where platforms were filled with beds, makeshift kitchens, and even libraries. Government agencies distributed gas masks, though they were rarely used, and organized ARP wardens patrolled streets during blackouts to enforce safety. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, himself a Londoner, rallied the population with speeches that framed the defense of London as the defense of civilization itself. His words carried across the wireless and were often quoted in newspapers plastered on the walls of bombed-out buildings. Morale, though battered, held firm. "London can take it," became the refrain of the time. By mid-1941, the Luftwaffe had shifted its attention to the Soviet Union, and the intensity of raids on London diminished. But new threats emerged later in the war. From 1944, Germany began launching V-1 flying bombs, nicknamed doodlebugs. These pilotless weapons buzzed ominously through the sky before falling silent and crashing into homes and streets. Thousands were killed in London, killing more than 6,000 people. They were followed by the V-2 rockets, supersonic missiles against which there was no defense. The first struck Chiswick in September 1944. In all, over 1,300 V-2s hit London before the war's end. Despite the destruction, life in London continued. Cinemas and theaters stayed open, albeit with interruptions during raids. The West End staged performances as a show of defiance. The city adapted, too. Prefabricated houses sprang up in bombed districts, allotments were dug in parks, and rationing shaped every meal. London also became the nerve center of the Allied war effort. Government offices relocated underground into bunkers, most famously the Cabinet War Rooms beneath Whitehall, from which Churchill directed strategy. The capital hosted troops from across the Empire and Allied nations, as well as refugees. The American presence grew after the U.S. entered the war in 1941, bringing a new cultural influence: swing music, chewing gum, and GIs in the streets. The war culminated in spring 1945. On May 8th, when Germany surrendered, London erupted in celebration. Crowds flooded Trafalgar Square, Piccadilly Circus, and outside Buckingham Palace, where Churchill and the royal family appeared on the balcony to greet the masses. VE Day marked the end of 6 years of fear and hardship. For Londoners, it was both a release and a remembrance of what had been lost. The cost had been immense. London had suffered more than 1.4 million houses damaged or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods in the East End lay in ruins, while ancient churches and medieval guild halls had vanished. The city's population, which had peaked at nearly 9 million before the war, declined sharply due to evacuation, destruction, and the hardships of daily life. Yet amid the devastation lay a new sense of purpose. Londoners had endured the most sustained bombing campaign of any capital in Europe, and their survival had come to symbolize Britain's defiance of Nazi Germany. The resilience of London in the Second World War became woven into the city's identity, shaping its memory for generations. By 1945, London emerged battered but unbroken, standing once again at the heart of a world conflict and preparing for the monumental task of rebuilding in the years to come. When the guns fell silent in 1945, London emerged victorious, yet visibly broken. The capital of Britain, once the proud heart of the empire, had endured nearly 6 years of bombing that left entire districts gutted. More than 1 million houses had been damaged or destroyed. Streets that once thrived with shops and homes were now wastelands of rubble. The East End, with its docks and working-class neighborhoods, bore the deepest scars. Londoners celebrated V-Day with unrestrained joy, but beneath the jubilant crowds lay the heavy burden of reconstruction. The priority was housing. Wartime devastation and a growing population created an acute shortage. Thousands lived in temporary shelters, while others crowded into damaged homes. The government's solution was the prefabricated house, or prefab. Small, quickly assembled, and fitted with modern conveniences, these homes were erected across London from 1945 onward. Entire prefab estates appeared in places like Catford and Wembley, providing families with badly needed accommodation. Some were intended to last only a decade, yet many stood for generations. The post-war government, led by Clement Attlee, embarked on ambitious social reforms that transformed London life. The creation of the National Health Service in 1948 gave Londoners free access to health care for the first time, while national insurance and welfare programs provided new security for the poor and unemployed. Bombed-out areas were targeted for redevelopment, guided by the Abercrombie Plan of 1944, which envisioned green belts around London and the creation of new towns like Stevenage, Harlow, and Basildon to ease overcrowding in the capital. Yet rebuilding was slow and uneven. In central London, some historic sites were restored: the Houses of Parliament, the Inns of Court, and many of Wren's churches. But others were lost forever, sacrificed to modern development. The Festival of Britain in 1951, held on the South Bank, symbolized national renewal. Its futuristic architecture, including the Dome of Discovery and the Skylon Tower, represented optimism for a modern London. The Royal Festival Hall, built for the event, remains a lasting landmark. Immigration reshaped the city profoundly. In 1948, the ship Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury, bringing hundreds of migrants from the Caribbean to help rebuild post-war Britain. They were followed by thousands more from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa in the 1950s and 1960s. These new communities settled in districts like Brixton, Notting Hill, and Southall, contributing to London's workforce and culture, but also facing racism and discrimination. Their presence transformed London into a truly multicultural city, though not without tensions. The Notting Hill race riots of 1958 revealed hostility toward immigrants, while the subsequent Notting Hill Carnival, begun in 1966, grew into a celebration of Caribbean culture and resilience. London's economy shifted in these years. The docks, once the lifeblood of the city, struggled to adapt to containerization and larger ships. By the 1960s and 70s, much of the docklands in the East End had fallen silent, creating unemployment and decay in surrounding neighborhoods. Industry declined, but finance and services in the City of London grew in importance, consolidating the capital's role as a global financial hub. Cultural life flourished. In the 1960s, London became synonymous with fashion, music, and youth culture. Carnaby Street, Soho, and Chelsea became centers of style, epitomized by designers like Mary Quant and bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. The swinging 60s projected London as the capital of cool, its imagery beaming across the world. In film, the city appeared in classics like Alfie, 1966, and Blow Up, 1966, capturing the vibrancy and restlessness of the age. At the same time, London grappled with social challenges. Poverty persisted in many districts, and slum clearances often uprooted communities, replacing terraced housing with high-rise estates. While some new developments improved living conditions, others quickly deteriorated, becoming symbols of urban neglect. The Ronan Point disaster of 1968, when a tower block in East London partially collapsed, highlighted the risks of poor design and construction. Political turbulence also shaped the post-war decades. London was the stage for protests and movements that reflected broader currents of change. In 1968, anti-Vietnam War demonstrators clashed with police outside the U.S. Embassy in Grosvenor Square. In the 1970s, the city was shaken by terrorism, including bombings by the Irish Republican Army, IRA, which targeted pubs, stations, and shopping districts. The bomb at the Old Bailey in 1973 and the explosion at Harrods in 1974 brought fear into daily life. Meanwhile, economic crises battered the capital. Inflation, strikes, and unemployment marked the 1970s. The Winter of Discontent in 1978-79 saw public services grind to a halt, rubbish pile up in Leicester Square, and even graves go unburied. London, like the nation, seemed weary, caught between fading imperial prestige and the uncertain future of a post-industrial society. By 1979, when Margaret Thatcher came to power, London was a city transformed by war, immigration, and cultural revolution, yet still scarred by poverty, decline, and social conflict. The skyline had begun to change with modernist architecture, but so had the fabric of its communities, now enriched by diversity but divided by inequality. The city had endured devastation and renewal, boom and crisis, repairing, without yet knowing it, for another dramatic reinvention in the decades to follow. The dawn of the 1980s found London at a crossroads. The city had endured decades of decline, deindustrialization, economic stagnation, and social unrest, but it was also poised for a radical transformation that would reshape its economy, culture, and global identity. Under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who came to power in 1979, London became the testing ground for new economic policies that emphasized privatization, deregulation, and finance over manufacturing. These changes would elevate London once again as a world financial capital, but not without deep divisions. One of the most visible symbols of this shift was the fate of the Docklands. Once the beating heart of imperial trade, by the 1970s the docks lay abandoned, victims of containerization and declining global shipping. Vast tracts of derelict land stretched across East London. In 1981, the government created the London Docklands Development Corporation, LDDC, to revive the area. Out of rubble and decay rose Canary Wharf, a gleaming financial district centered on One Canada Square, completed in 1991. Its steel and glass towers were heralded as a new vision of London's future, though many East Enders felt excluded, displaced from their own neighborhoods by soaring property prices. The city's financial sector underwent its own revolution. On October 27, 1986, the Big Bang deregulation of the London Stock Exchange swept away centuries-old practices, allowing foreign firms greater access and introducing electronic trading. Overnight, London's financial markets expanded, attracting global banks and investment houses. The city of London boomed, and the skyline grew dense with modern office towers. London once again became the preeminent financial hub of Europe and rivaled New York as a center of global finance. Yet the social cost of these changes was sharp. Many working-class communities faced unemployment as manufacturing jobs disappeared, and inequality widened between the wealthy financial elite and the poorer districts of East and South London. Racial tensions, already strained, erupted in 1981 with the Brixton riots, triggered by heavy-handed policing of Afro-Caribbean youth. Similar uprisings followed in Tottenham in 1985, where the Broadwater Farm Estate became a flashpoint. These riots exposed the fault lines of policing, poverty, and race in modern London, forcing authorities to reckon with systemic inequality. Despite these tensions, London also became a magnet for culture and creativity. The 1980s music scene flourished, with London producing and hosting artists from punk to new wave, from reggae to electronic music. The city's clubs, from Soho's Marquee to Camden's Dingwalls, became crucibles of experimentation. Meanwhile, London fashion, epitomized by designers like Vivienne Westwood and Alexander McQueen, gained global recognition. The city's rebellious creativity contrasted with the corporate culture of the city, yet together they fueled London's reputation as a dynamic metropolis. Politically, London was also reshaped. In 1986, the Thatcher government abolished the Greater London Council, GLC, led at the time by Ken Livingstone, leaving the capital without a central government authority. Many saw this as a deliberate move to weaken left-wing opposition. For more than a decade, London's governance was fragmented among borough councils and Whitehall until the creation of the Greater London Authority, GLA, and the Office of the Mayor of London in 2000, marking a new era of citywide leadership. The 1990s brought both optimism and challenge. London was at the forefront of Britain's cultural resurgence, dubbed Cool Britannia. Bands like Oasis, Blur, and the Spice Girls dominated global pop culture, while London's art world flourished with the rise of the young British artists, including Damien Hirst and Tracey Emin. The Tate Modern, housed in the converted Bankside Power Station and opened in 2000, became a symbol of the city's artistic reinvention. London also began embracing its multicultural identity more openly. By the 1990s, immigrants and their descendants from the Caribbean, South Asia, Africa, and beyond had reshaped the cultural fabric of the city. Festivals like the Notting Hill Carnival drew hundreds of thousands, while Brick Lane thrived as a hub of Bangladeshi culture. London cuisine, once derided for its blandness, became globally diverse, reflecting the flavors of its immigrant communities. Tragedy, however, was never far away. The IRA's bombing campaign continued to target London throughout the 1980s and 1990s, bringing terror to the heart of the capital. The Docklands bombing in February 1996 devastated part of Canary Wharf, killing 2 people and injuring over 100, a stark reminder that the city's rebirth was shadowed by violence. The signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 helped bring peace to Northern Ireland and ended the most intense period of IRA bombings in London, though memories of attacks on Oxford Street, Harrods, and London Bridge lingered. The city also modernized its infrastructure. The Docklands Light Railway, DLR, opened in 1987, connected the emerging Canary Wharf district to the wider city. Heathrow expanded as one of the busiest airports in the world, while plans for the Jubilee Line extension, which opened in 1999, brought futuristic stations designed by leading architects. These projects underscored London's ambition to function as a 21st century global city. By the close of the 20th century, London had been transformed. The derelict docks had given way to skyscrapers. The city had endured riots, terror attacks, and sharp inequalities, yet it had also become the beating heart of finance, culture, and multiculturalism. On December 31st, 1999, crowds gathered along the Thames as fireworks lit the night sky and the newly built London Eye turned slowly for the first time. The Millennium celebrations symbolized both reflection and renewal. London entered the 21st century with contradictions unresolved, a city of wealth and poverty, tradition and innovation, conflict and creativity. But it was clear that London had once again reasserted itself as a city not only central to Britain, but to the world. As the new millennium dawned, London emerged as a city redefined. The fireworks that illuminated the Thames on the night of December 31st, 1999, framed a capital poised for the challenges of the 21st century. The London Eye, Europe's tallest Ferris wheel at the time, became an instant landmark, its slow rotation symbolizing both continuity and change. In the decades that followed, London would experience economic triumph, political upheaval, tragedy, resilience, and profound transformation all within a single generation. The early 2000s marked a period of optimism. The creation of the Greater London Authority, GLA, and the election of Ken Livingstone as London's first directly elected mayor in 2000 gave the city a unified political voice for the first time since the abolition of the Greater London Council. Livingstone's tenure emphasized public transport, sustainability, and inclusivity. In 2003, London became the first major city to introduce a congestion charge to reduce traffic in its crowded center. Though controversial at first, the policy later proved influential as other cities around the world adopted similar measures. The skyline of London began to transform dramatically. The iconic Gherkin 30 St. Mary Axe, designed by Norman Foster, was completed in 2004, symbolizing the architectural ambition of the city. Soon after followed the Shard, Europe's tallest building when completed in 2012, was designed by Renzo Piano and soared 310 meters above the Thames. These glass towers reflected London's confidence as a global financial hub, even as critics worried that its identity as a city of historic neighborhoods was being overshadowed by corporate skyscrapers. The city's diversity deepened further in the 21st century. By the 2011 census, over 40% of London's residents identified as part of an ethnic minority, and more than 300 languages were spoken across the metropolis. Areas like Brixton, Southall, Whitechapel, and Wembley thrived as cultural hubs, embodying London as a microcosm of globalization. This multiculturalism infused the city's food, art, and music scenes, making London one of the most culturally dynamic cities in the world. Yet London also faced immense challenges. On July 7, 2005, coordinated terrorist attacks struck the London Underground and a bus in Tavistock Square, killing 52 civilians and injuring more than 700. Known as the 7/7 bombings, the attacks represented the deadliest act of terrorism on British soil since the Second World War. The tragedy shocked the city but also demonstrated its resilience. Just one day earlier, London had celebrated its successful bid to host the 2012 Olympic Games, and the contrast between joy and devastation became etched into the city's collective memory. The financial crisis of 2008 tested London's identity as a global financial center. Banks collapsed, jobs were lost, and the city faced intense scrutiny. Yet London weathered the storm better than many, maintaining its place alongside New York as a leading global financial hub. This resilience was reflected in its successful hosting of the 2012 London Olympics, an event that reintroduced the city to the world. The Games transformed Stratford and the East End, leaving behind the Olympic Park, stadiums, and new infrastructure, while ceremonies celebrated London's history, diversity, and culture. For many, the Olympics symbolized a moment when London felt united and global in spirit. But political turbulence soon followed. In 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union in the Brexit referendum. London, however, voted decisively to remain, highlighting its cosmopolitan outlook compared to other regions. The decision unleashed uncertainty over the city's financial future, immigration policies, and role as Europe's gateway. Many businesses relocated some operations to Paris, Frankfurt, or Dublin, Yet London retained its global magnetism, continuing to attract talent, investment, and creativity. The 21st century also brought new mayors and new policies. Boris Johnson, who succeeded Livingstone in 2008, championed cycling infrastructure, expanded bus services, and oversaw projects like the Emirates Airline cable car and preparations for the Olympics. In 2016, Sadiq Khan became London's first Muslim mayor, a milestone reflecting the city's diversity. Khan's tenure emphasized environmental measures, affordable housing, and expanding the ultra-low emission zone, ULEZ, to combat air pollution, a pressing concern in one of Europe's busiest metropolises. London's growth has not been without strain. Skyrocketing house prices and rents have driven debates about affordability and inequality. Many Londoners face the paradox of living in a city that is both immensely wealthy and deeply unequal, where luxury apartments overlook communities struggling with poverty. Infrastructure has also grown under the weight of a population that passed 9 million by 2020, with projects like Crossrail, the Elizabeth Line, delayed repeatedly before its long-awaited opening in 2022. The COVID-19 pandemic struck London hard. Beginning in early 2020, the city saw its streets emptied during lockdowns, public transport halted, and businesses shuttered. Iconic landmarks such as Trafalgar Square, Piccadilly Circus, and the West End theaters lay eerily silent. Yet London also displayed resilience. Its hospitals bore the brunt of the crisis, while communities organized mutual aid networks, and scientists at nearby Oxford University developed one of the first vaccines distributed worldwide. The pandemic highlighted both the fragility and adaptability of life in the metropolis. In recent years, London has grappled with its history as well as its future. The Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 brought renewed attention to monuments and legacies tied to the British Empire and the slave trade. Statues and street names became sites of debate, reflecting broader questions about identity, memory, and justice in a city built on centuries of imperial wealth. Culturally, London continues to thrive. Its museums, theaters, and galleries, from the British Museum to the National Theatre and Tate Modern, remain among the most visited in the world. The West End endures as a global capital of theatre, while London Fashion Week, film festivals, and a pulsating music scene keep the city at the cutting edge of creativity. Its football clubs, from Arsenal to Chelsea, Tottenham to West Ham, carry its name to millions across the globe. Today, London is a city of paradoxes, at once ancient and modern, traditional and experimental, deeply British yet unmistakably global. From the medieval walls of the Tower to the glass heights of the Shard, from the immigrant stalls of Brixton Market to the financial towers of Canary Wharf, London encapsulates both continuity and reinvention. As the city strides further into the 21st century, it remains what it has always been, a place of resilience, diversity, and ceaseless transformation. For over 2 millennia, London has absorbed shocks, fires, plagues, bombings, and riots, and yet it endures, remaking itself each time. In that constant reinvention lies the true story of London, a city never fixed in time, but always in motion. For nearly 2,000 years, London has stood at the crossing of river and road, power and people. Born in Conquest in 47 CE, it grew from a Roman outpost into a medieval stronghold, from a capital of monarchy into the beating heart of an empire that spanned the globe. Along the banks of the Thames, emperors, kings, merchants, rebels, and workers have each left their mark, sometimes in stone, sometimes in fire, and often in the fragile memory of those who lived through its triumphs and disasters. London's story has always been one of resilience. Few cities have burned as often or been rebuilt with such determination. From the ashes of Boudica's revolt in 60 CE, from the wreckage of the Great Fire of 1666, from the smoldering ruins of the Blitz in 1940, Londoners have carried on. Their city has been scarred by plague, sharpened by famine, tested by riots and terror, yet each time it has risen, layered and transformed, never quite the same, but never wholly broken. It is a city of paradoxes. Its streets carry the grandeur of empire, but also the shadows of colonial exploitation. Its museums hold the treasures of the world, gathered under banners of both curiosity and conquest. Its skyline reflects medieval towers beside glass pinnacles of global finance. Its people, once tribes of the Trinovans and Catavilani, then Romans, Saxons, Normans, Tudors, and Georgians, are now a living mosaic of every nation, faith, and culture, making London both profoundly British and unmistakably global. What has bound it all together is not just its river or its crown, not just its parliament or its markets, but the spirit of those who call it home. Dockworkers and playwrights, bankers and suffragettes, immigrants and innovators. Each generation has remade London in its own image, carrying forward a city that belongs to no single ruler, no single class, no single century. Today, London stands as one of the world's greatest capitals, a place where history and modernity walk side by side. The stones of the tower still cast their shadow on the Thames, even as the Shard gleams above it. Shakespeare's Globe stands once more, rebuilt on the South Bank, while a train on the Elizabeth line carries passengers beneath the river on rails that would have been unimaginable even 100 years ago. If there is a lesson in London's long story, it is that no disaster, no upheaval, no empire gained or lost has ever stilled its pulse. London endures because it adapts. Its power lies not in permanence, but in reinvention. And so long as the Thames flows, carrying its waters out to the sea, London will remain a city of resilience, diversity, and ceaseless transformation. It is, as it has always been, a city in motion.